Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. Today, I celebrate the season with a full length review of sorts of my personal favorite Christie novel, Hercule Poirot's Christmas, also called Murder for Christmas and A Holiday for Murder, first published in 1938. And like I said at the end of my previous video, I wanted to do more full length reviews of certain novels when it's, seasonably appropriate or on special anniversaries. So, what better time than to cover this book than on Christmas? And as I've said, this is my favorite Christie novel, though I recognize it's not the best quality book. However, I still think it's of excellent quality. It is at number 5 on my Poirot novel ranking, and when taking all of Christie's works into one list, it's probably around number 8 or 9, which is very good since there are 66 full-length Christie novels. Before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. I recently broke 100 subscribers, a big milestone, so let's keep this channel going. I'm going to start off this video with a spoiler-free summary of the novel, mixing in some of my thoughts as well. I will summarize up until the point of the culprit reveal, and then I will warn you when it's coming, and from that point on, there will be spoilers for this novel only. I'll spoil no other Christie novel. I'll finish the summary, give my thoughts on what works and what doesn't work, discuss the characters, and then end with my final thoughts. And let's begin with the beginning. Christie has some very memorable openings into her novels, and I don't feel as if Hercule Poirot's Christmas is one of those, but I love this style of opening where we meet most of the characters as they prepare for their Christmas plans. The Hollow and Death on the Nile have similar openings with brief vignettes introducing us to the characters, and while there isn't a lot of plot happening, there is a lot of character work. These moments are revealing personality wise, which is very important for this book in particularly. We begin with Stephen Farr on a train where he meets and falls immediately in love with Pilar Estravados, who I think are two of the more exciting characters in this book individually. They are both new to England and they discuss their first day experience in the country. But the more plot relevant part of the opening comes from Alfred and Lydia Lee, one of Simeon Lee's sons and his wife. They discuss Alfred's father, Simeon, who is a tyrannical patriarch. Simeon Lee made a fortune in South Africa on diamonds, and since moving to England, he's retreated from his wild lifestyle of womanizing and whatever debauchery he was up to. Now that Simeon is old and frail, he can't do the same things he always did and needs to entertain himself in crueler ways. For Christmas, Simeon invites all four of his sons and their spouses to Gorston Hall. The Leaf family is mostly estranged. His other sons are George, this boring, stuffy member of parliament, David, who is estranged from his family since his mother died, and Harry, a black sheep whom no one even knows where he is. He also invites Pilar, who is Simeon's only grandchild, through his daughter Jennifer, who is deceased. And Jennifer married a Spaniard named Juan Estravados, which, tore up the family. And now that both of them are dead, he decides to invite Pilar to, set up that connection with her. And no one has met Pilar before either. And these invitations really bother Alfred, who is devoted to his father, but is always brushed aside because Simeon finds Alfred boring and will like the likes of Harry and Pilar so more vibrant and interesting. And things come to a head first when Alfred learns Harry and Pilar are going to live in Gorston Hall. They're not merely visiting. And things further come to a head when Simeon makes sure his entire family overhears him call up his lawyer wanting to make a new will. And this is one of the best scenes in any Christie novel. I love it. And Simeon Lee is on the phone, and his manservant Horbury alerts him that the family is coming up to his room as all is planned. Most of them are upset by this news about making a new will, except for Harry and Pilar, who are excited because they don't think they're in the old will, so they think this new will has to be in their favor. And Simeon Lee makes these little digging comments at certain people. He really knows how to twist the knife in his family's backs. This book was published immediately after Appointment with Death, and you can see the parallels between Simeon Lee and Mrs. Boynton, who is the victim in that book. He makes snide comments to George's wife Magdalena about having to make her own clothes and living with a sailor at one point, which makes her blush. Ostensibly the sailor is her father, but she's very clearly having an affair, and seemingly uses the vague terms to just get a little stab in her. and she also has like all these debts behind her husband's back, and Simeon threatens to cut off George's allowance, which angers him. He insults his own late wife, which upsets David, who was close with his mother and blames his father for her death. And the most iconic moment from this series of iconic moments comes from David's wife, Hilda, who gets into it with Simeon Lee. These two have never actually met before. And Hilda says, she's afraid. And Simeon asks, "Oh, you're afraid of me?" And she says, "No, I'm afraid for you," which is like this fantastic way to end this scene. And then Christmas Eve comes along, and this is the big chapter where you have to read closely and pay attention. I love to read each chapter on the day they occur, and Christmas Eve is super busy for me, and it's the longest chapter in the book, but it's so worth it, just especially for this like pre-murder scene. Tensions are high in Gorston Hall after Simeon Lee's insults. Family members are even more at odds with each other than ever before. The dinner scene is one of the best scenes in Christie. It's told mainly from the butler Tressilian's perspective, and he treats us all to these like wonderful anecdotes about how each character eats dinner, further revealing their true nature. George and Harry devour their food like wild animals, while Alfred barely eats, and David is just so distraught he keeps knocking things over. And Tressilian also tells us about how the women dress, and which have style, and which are totally clueless, with David's wife Hilda receiving the brunt of criticism. Earlier, there was a visit from Superintendent Sugden to Simeon Lee about collecting for the police charity, which upsets Horbury. And there's a lot of talk about Horbury being a thief with really no evidence for this. It's mostly based in classism, with the wealthy Lees being really snobby toward the servant class, with most of them just hating Horbury, but they can't do anything about it. I mean, Simeon Lee loves Horbury as his valet. There really isn't anyone they can get to replace him. Servants are gradually disappearing, and this would speed up post war. Then, after dinner, there's this loud crash and a noisy commotion coming from Simeon Lee's room. The door is locked and has to be forced down. Inside is a dead Simeon Lee, and all of the furniture in the room is knocked over and destroyed. There's blood everywhere. Clearly, a fight has happened, but this is a classic golden era locked room mystery, which we rarely see in Christie, but we have one here. And I will say, this is one of the best locked room mysteries in terms of solution. Christie avoids going through ridiculous means to solve it like many other authors do in their locked room murders. Poirot is called in along with Colonel Johnson, whom we last saw in Three Act Tragedy. I love this conversation they have about murder during Christmas time, where Poirot was just shocked that Colonel Johnson thinks Christmas is an unlikely time for murder, while Poirot thinks it's the ideal time because people are pretending to like other people they hate in the spirit of goodwill and the holiday season, and there's just too much for them to handle and they snap. It's unfortunate that doesn't really play a role in the story, however, but we also have Poirot complaining about Johnson's lack of central heating, which I always found funny. Sugden tells Poirot that he wasn't really calling on Simeon Lee for the police charity, but Simeon Lee called him about a theft of uncut diamonds he kept in his safe. The diamonds are missing, and Sugden wouldn't say who Lee suspected, but I think it's clear we're supposed to suspect either Horbury or Pilar of the theft. Then we get a long series of interviews, and this is one of my pet peeves. I don't like long series of interviews, but this one is actually pretty good. There's a lot of fun character moments here, and not a lot of like working out mechanics and timeline. In short, everybody has an alibi, but Poirot isn't really satisfied with any of them. George and Magdalena come out as the most suspicious because they both claim to be telephoning, which is easily disproven. Pilar just has like a grand old time with this. She's flirting with Harry and Stephen and even Superintendent Sugden. Hilda comes out as the most intelligently, as she willingly admits her feelings of regret for dragging David along. She thought her father in law wanted reconciliation in his old age, but he actually just wanted to torture David. Pilar is also suspicious because she apparently tried to take two small items from the crime scene, a small piece of rubber and a wooden peg. Poirot has to ask Sugden to see them following the day, but Poirot doesn't seem like to be that interested in them, and we know Poirot's not really interested in like the physical clues themselves. Poirot finds the stolen diamonds in a stone sink designed by Lydia. She makes these like, I guess they're like terrariums almost of different places around the world. And this one is of the Dead Sea. But again, he doesn't really seem that interested in the thefts of diamonds at all. Poirot mostly focuses on Simeon Lee's character. This is one of the biggest novels where Poirot advocates that the solution of the crime lies within the psychology of the victim. We see this, in other novels that well, but I feel it's really prevalent here. Simeon Lee was always a cruel man, a wicked, and would stop at nothing to seek revenge on those who wronged him. He had numerous affairs, an unhappy wife, unhappy children. He kept a bunch of uncut diamonds because they reminded him of South Africa and the old days. He doesn't want to make them sparkle and sell them. Meanwhile, Pilar has seemingly decided on Stephen Farr as a boyfriend, and Stephen is at Gorson Hall because he's the son of Simeon Lee's old business partner. Pilar and Stephen play with balloons, and one of them pops, which makes Pilar realize that what she found in her grandfather's room was a popped balloon. She is then almost murdered with a cannonball booby trap, and I will say, this is one of those late book murders that sometimes just feel like really forced in there. It's not the worst thing, but I could have done without it. And this is the point where I'm going to switch to spoilers. So if you want to continue listening to the rest of the summary and my full analysis, be warned, there are spoilers ahead. Poirot, really from the beginning, seemingly knows what happened at Gorston Hall and who killed Simeon Lee, but he first solves a series of other minor mysteries. Stephen Farr is not Stephen Farr, the son of Ebenezer Farr, but an illegitimate son of Simeon Lee, with Lee having once bragged that he had many children on the other side of the blanket from all his affairs. Stephen was curious as to what his father was like, but insists he didn't kill him. Pilar is also not Pilar, but a woman named Conchita Lopez, a friend of Pilar's. The real Pilar died in a bombing during the Spanish Civil War on the way to England, so Conchita pretended to be Pilar, really for the excitement to see if she could pull it off, and because she thought there was money for her. Like, she's a very poor woman, and she thought this would be a good way to get money. There's also some business regarding Simeon Lee's will, which leaves half of his estate to Alfred and the other half split amongst his children, including Harry, who he thought was disinherited. The will also names Jennifer, but since Jennifer is dead and Pilar is not named, Jennifer's share of the estate goes to the other brothers. And this causes a huge argument between the brothers over like what right Pilar has to the money, which leads her to confess her truth. But none of this matters. And in fact, almost nothing that happened in this story mattered because the murderer is Superintendent Sugden, who is yet another illegitimate son of Simeon Lee, who wanted revenge for his father's abandoning him and his mother. And this comes as a shock to many people, but Poirot reminds everyone that police officers are people too, and they have fathers and they have emotions and lives beyond their career. I've always loved this twist, as I said in my video on Christie's best twist endings. It's just so unexpected, and Christie keeps pointing you in this direction, but the reader is just continuing to ignore her. Let's move on to what works in this book, and I think a lot works. Christie plays extremely fair here. She is constantly, often just blatantly, going out of her way to have Sugden do the same thing Simeon Lee does, and the same thing Stephen Farr does, and the same thing Harry Lee does. Pilar, on multiple occasions, describes that bunch of men as looking very handsome and having the same mannerisms. It happens like a dozen times. Tressilian is constantly mixing these people up from a distance. So is Lydia. So is like Magdalena. This is one of the best examples of Christie playing fair, and because of the twist of the police inspector did it, Christie has the freedom to be a lot less subtle than she normally is, because she knows her readers are absolutely on the wrong track. They're never going to look at the police inspector. She can show her cards more, and she does. Something else this book does well is the locked room mystery component. I adore locked room mysteries, but the solutions tend to be just like overly complicated, and quite frankly, no murderer would actually use these methods to commit their crimes. And while this one has some clunkiness to it, it is absolutely one of the more believable mechanics wise. Sugden murders Simeon Lee during his initial visit that was, allegedly about the police charity and then allegedly about the stolen diamonds. He quietly murdered his father, then set the scene. Then, much later, he pulled on two ropes that he had rigged around the furniture, causing it to crash and making the commotion, leading everyone to believe the murder happened much later than it actually did. And this is a classic Christian trope. What we are told to believe, we believed, and we shouldn't have. And whenever there's like a very specific timeline in Christie, you should know that that timeline is, there's something wrong with it. And we are with the characters when the commotion happens, and we still think it must be one of them. We believe the murder happened when the noise happened. And Christie is an expert at blocking scenes. Both the initial arrival of Sugden in the afternoon and the later scene with the commotion are told in what appears to be excruciating detail, and yet a murderer slips in there. It is a very classic Christie thing to trick readers in just a few words. Sugden said he was collecting for the police charity, so we believe that, even though we did not see his conversation with Simeon Lee. He later changed his story to one about the stolen diamonds, and we believe that, even though we didn't see that conversation either. This is a book in which Christie shows us almost every minute of the Lee's days around the Christmas holiday, yet she did not show us two important conversations. That should have been a red flag. It's the same thing with all the noise. We heard noise that made us think a murder happened, but we didn't see a murder happen. Using only one sense, especially only sound, is something Christie does a lot to deceive us. She also lays in her clues here very well. There are a lot of clues and good clues in this book. I've talked in a previous video about Pilar's line that Sugden is very handsome, like a young Simeon Lee, revealing his true past. There's another great clue involving the piece of rubber and the wooden peg, not those items themselves. Poirot is rarely interested in the physical clues, but the fact that Sugden never told him about these items is another red flag. Poirot has to ask Sugden about them after Magdalena brought it up to him. Sugden never volunteered this, and then when Magdalena does tell Poirot, there are actually different items matching the same description. The final positive I'll talk about is the characters. Not so much the characters individually, as I really only find like Simeon Lee to be like an absolute top tier character, but the dynamics between these characters are wonderful. The relationship between Lydia and Alfred, this middle aged couple who've grown a little distant but are still in love, is so different than like the typical relationship you see in a Christie novel. There's a lot of love and hate, push and pull going on between like Alfred and his father, Alfred and Harry, George and Magdalena. We don't see these dynamics a lot in Christie novels, especially to these depths. We do see them sort of superficially, but this book doesn't have a lot of the Christie typical characters you see. Other than Pilar, there's really not like that young, plucky heroine and, the old Anglo colonel or the middle-aged spinster. So while I don't find these characters to be like absolute standouts in the grand scheme of Christie, I do find them interesting and unique. Now, this book is not perfect, and there are some things, mostly minor, that just don't work for me. I gave this book credit for being a more believable locked room mystery, but it is still a locked room mystery, and it comes with all the typical issues and credibility. Sugden had to gain admittance to the house, sneak in a rope and jars of animal blood under his coat, convince Simeon Lee that a diamond theft had occurred, convinced him to open the safe, quietly murder him, and then set up the scene, hang the wires out the window, leave the scene and the wires there for hours without anyone noticing, and then pulling the wires and then hiding them around his body as he investigated the crime. It's a lot of steps to be credible. Now, I believe it could happen, but a lot of obfuscation comes from the fact that Gorson Hall is full of newcomers and long lost relatives Sugden couldn't have accounted for, and he would also have to know the inner dynamics of the Lee family. I suppose it's possible. We are told that Simeon Lee went to the police to track down Pilar and Harry, so Sugden could have found out that way. And Simeon Lee seems to be well known in the area, so maybe the domestic routine was known, but it's also Christmas Eve when the routine could have been thrown off. It's a bit convoluted, but it does work. It's just not as smooth as many other Christie novels. My other main issue is that if you were able to suss out Sugden early on, I think this book might not be the most interesting for you because once you're on that track, it's very obvious. A reread of this novel will demonstrate just how obvious the solution is when you know it, much more so than other Christie novels. She really pushes Sugden in your face and relies entirely on the fact that he is a policeman to obfuscate this novel. I have some other minor issues. I think Pilar is not depicted great, but we'll get into that in the character section. I think this fawning over Pilar from Harry and Stephen Farr, and even Sugden is just gross because they're under the belief that she's their niece. She's not, but they don't know that, and it's icky. And even Simeon Lee mentions, "Oh, like yeah, Pilar's so beautiful," and like pushes Harry toward her and seemingly approves of Harry's attraction to Pilar. It's gross. I didn't need it, and move on from there. Characters. Let's start with the big guy, Hercule Poirot. Poirot isn't in this novel too much. He first appears about halfway in, and while he does play something of a second fiddle to Johnson and Sugden, this novel heavy into the Poirot armchair detective, where he just sits back and thinks. People come to him, and he isn't really like overly active here. His brain is very fertile, and he pretty much instantly knows everything in a very credible manner. This is a great book for Poirot character wise. I love his spiel about preferring the central heating and how miserable he is in front of Colonel Johnson's fire instead of the central heating. There's this fun little scene where he buys a fake mustache, and everyone's like, why did he buy a mustache? Is his fake? And there are a lot of fun moments with Poirot, but I do feel his presence wasn't as grand as I would have liked, and I do think he takes something of a back seat in terms of the investigation. We'll skip Colonel Johnson since he's little more than the generic inspector, other than he is just totally clueless here, and move on to our murderer, Superintendent Sugden, who I've ranked as number 45 of 100 Christie killers. I think he works for the book, but I did feel his character was mostly his physical appearance and his mannerisms, which is very necessary for plot purposes. I wish we saw more of his inner emotion so we could see this vindictive nature that he is someone who would want to seek revenge against his father. I understand why Christie doesn't do this because she never does this with her inspectors. I don't find him the most interesting character or murder out there. His victim, Simeon Lee, is one of the best victims in a Christie novel. I had him at number 4 on my victims list. I love his like complete jerk victims, and Simeon Lee is an expert at twisting the knife and knowing exactly the right thing to say and to send people flying off the wall. I love how, because he can't live the adventurous lifestyle he once did, he resorts to the mental anguish and torture of others for his amusement. It helps he doesn't really like any member of his family except for Pilar and maybe Harry. He does have issues with Harry, but they are cut from the same cloth. He's just an all around brilliant character. Alfred Lee is also a good character. He's one of the two Lees whom Poirot thinks could commit a murder. He's the devoted son who just puts up with everything his father throws at him, and he puts his father's interests above his own and his wife's own interests. He hates Harry on his father's behalf, even though Simeon Lee just apparently doesn't really care about Harry anymore. He's basically wrecked his life because he's weak-willed. He can't stand up to his father. And we see Lydia really taking charge of things that Alfred should be doing. Alfred is technically the head of the family after his father dies, but Lydia is the one taking charge. She leads the family during the will discussion. And she has this hobby of building stone sinks. And she really strives for a more interesting life. You can tell she lives vicariously through her art. She does push Alfred at times, but never super hard because it upsets Alfred. And you can just feel this relief from her when it's all settled and she can just finally like relax and live her life with Alfred the way she wants to. She's always concerned about Alfred and how she wishes the murder was outside the family because otherwise it would upset Alfred. And there's a great scene with her and Poirot where she mentions this, and Poirot's like, why can't not a member of the family and an outsider? And she's just totally upset by that. She has no idea what he's talking about. And I find that scene to be one of the better ones in this book. George and Magdalena are a fascinating couple. Individually, they're nothing special. George is the frugal MP gasbag who isn't likable at all, and Magdalena is like this flashy, young, sort of stupid woman. The other Lees don't think much of her, and she's likely having an affair. It's not clear, but I love the relationship between these two. They clearly are ill suited for each other and have different priorities, but are actually very similar. They cover for each other and defend each other when they are ganged up on. I think there's some love between these two, but it only comes out when their backs are against the wall. They absolutely refuse to hand over any of their inheritance out of quote unquote principle, which is really just their greed. And one would think, as an MP, George would be able to wield his influence, but he can't. He tries to do so over the police and gets smacked down. He tries to do so with his family, but they ignore him like he's not even there. And we have like one or two little comments about like how George is just like really a bad MP and he's just there to be basically like a backbencher and it really does contributes nothing to Parliament. David and Hilda are another fascinating pair. David is this timid, youthful looking man who has never been able to overcome his past. He obsessively dwells over the poor treatment of his mother, and this causes Hilda to act like his mother instead of his wife. Hilda is the other person Poirot thinks could commit a murder because she's the only who's actually like a competent, sensible human being. She's the only one basically with free will. She does withhold information from Poirot. She is outside the room when the commotion starts and doesn't say anything. And it's like this rare moment of fear from her. She too covers for her husband. In many ways, she has the advantage of being both a member of the family but also entirely outside the influence of Simeon Lee. She didn't meet him until the events of this book, so his intimidation tactics don't work on her, and she doesn't have to save face with him for money or love or whatever purpose. David is more or less a non factor in the book. He's basically out of contention as a murderer, as no one really believes he would actually do it. He's much happier after his father's death, and his murder seemed to have freed him from the spell of the past. And I think the relationship between David and Hilda is interesting because Hilda doesn't really let him get away with things. He's always using the past as an excuse, and Hilda just doesn't buy it. She gets very frustrated when he talks about his mother, whom Hilda has also never met but clearly doesn't like. She tells Poirot that David's mother put the brunt of her unhappiness on David, and as a child, it basically scarred him for life. So she really can't stand all this like goody good talk about his mother, even though she does feel somewhat sorry for her for the treatment she received from Simeon Lee. But I mean, to Hilda, she just simply doesn't care. Harry is a character type we see a lot, this like youngish adventurer full of bluster. But what's different about him is that he's also a coward. Poirot calls Harry out as too cowardly to have committed a murder and sees him for the a weak, just like David, but with this like swig of bravado. And Poirot uses the phrase that Simeon Lee, like all of his sons, are sort of terrible to include Harry with them. And Harry is very charming. He's able to sweet Pilar for a brief moment, and his father just doesn't care about whatever crimes Harry committed in the past, although seemingly does rail into him as well. But it's not really to the same extent as the others, but it is enough for seemingly to consider all of his known sons as weak and just like not great. And Harry loves teasing Alfred, and the two eventually reconcile. Everybody who matters in this novel gets a happy ending, although Harry does not get Pilar in the end, and he simply returns to his old lifestyle, but perhaps more mature. He doesn't have any real growth, but he's a fun character nonetheless. Stephen Farr, an illegitimate son of Simeon Lee, is very similar to Harry, which is intentional on Christie's part. Get a lot of physical descriptions of him and his mannerisms as well. He's a big character in the novel, but one that I think is like overly important. He doesn't really provide much insight into the Lees, nor does he really do much in the book. He does wind up with Pilar because he's the more solid and stable one when compared to Harry. And Sugden is, about to be hanged, so he's off the table. And Pilar is something of our heroine here, this young, plucky woman who is out for adventure. She thinks watching her driver get blown up is like the greatest thing that ever happened to her. She finds the Spanish Civil War to be thrilling, and she goes on to Gorston Hall pretending to be Pilar to see what she can get out of it. And when she gets nothing, she wants out. She doesn't want the lease to give her money. She wanted the thrill of deceiving people and getting the money that way. And this makes it appear like she is a Lee because this is something like Harry or Simeon Lee would have done. But she's not a Lee. She's Conchita Lopez. And she talks a lot about women and how they have to do whatever they can to make it in the world because the world is cruel to women. And there's a lot of foreshadowing her true nature with that. And I could do without this weird, like, anti Spanish sentiment thrown her way, and she's called uncivilized and sometimes gets taken to be stupid. Her father is portrayed as a violent man, like most Spanish men are depicted in these books, which isn't great. And because like Simeon Lee's throat was slashed, they immediately think, oh, that's a very Spanish thing. It must be Pilar. A lot of like stereotyping about that. It's nothing unusual from a Christie novel or any other mystery novel during this time period. But, icky and it could do without it. Tressilian is one of my favorite Christie butlers. He gets a lot of page time, and much of the middle portion of the book is told from his perspective. He's going blind and deaf, and his deja vu experiences are not only plot relevant, but almost humorous as he's constantly mixing people up. He has great commentary on the family, criticizing them in his own head, but never out loud, not even to the other servants. He hates Walter, the footman, and calls him like a stable boy. And there's some classism Christie throws at the servants here. She has this idea that servants like to be servants, and she uses Tressilian to whine about the dissipating servant class and how inconvenient that is. And he hates Horbury as well, who I find Horbury to be a decent character. There's a lot of hatred thrown at him as well as a thief and a criminal, really for no reason. He's considered the prime suspect, but we're never given any like concrete reason why, other than that he's a servant. And he does turn out to be innocent, which is, typical of Christie. And there's a phrase like, about the servants always doing it in mystery novels, but Christie doesn't really do that very often, and she doesn't do it here, other than a public servant, but that's not what, the butler did it means. And that concludes my review of Hercule Poirot's Christmas. In the future, I hope to do more full length novel reviews from Christie and other authors. I hope you enjoyed my discussion as much as I love this book. I also hope you all have a very Merry Christmas, a Happy Holiday, and a Happy New Year. Next week, I will have six more Christie theories slash conspiracies for you that I will discuss, so stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.